When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, a pair of bodies adorned a life-sized effigy in her funeral procession. These are not those bodies. The pair of bodies that I made previously on this channel are very close to the funeral effigy bodies that we have for Queen Elizabeth I. My problem with that is that they're not a great example of what would have or what could have been worn, especially by Queen Elizabeth I. They're made from very functional, sort of humble materials, but Queen Elizabeth I had loads of bodies in her inventory that were covered in silk or jewels or embroidery and just all sorts of extra. A couple of things that Queen Elizabeth I definitely was not was rudimentary and humble. But my problem then with that is that if you cover them in silk, it kind of covers up all of the handwork, which is kind of like the extra bit at this point in time, because we can fake silk, we can fake jewels, we can fake embroidery, but we can't fake hand stitching. So if I'm gonna put a lot of handwork into these, and I'm making these completely by hand, then I want to really show that off. So I think I'm gonna use silk organza. Conceptually go with what could have been worn at the time, but still show off some of the handwork. The problem with making a pair of bodies that is very close to what would have been worn historically is that it might come across costumey. It's usually used kind of as a derogative term, you know, like that's too costumey. My favorite, that's too literal. It's kind of a cheap dig at modern fashion. Like, what's the problem with a little drama? What's the problem with something being literal if you're excited about the thing that you were literally looking at? And this piece in particular being costumey or literal is actually not a problem for me because it kind of drives home a deeper point in the collection. If you can't tell, I'm dealing with some eclectic references for this collection, some of which I don't really have the words to communicate just yet, so I'm gonna leave you all in suspense as to exactly what this collection is about as a whole. I think that having a couple of pieces that are very dramatic in the collection is not a bad thing. Let's hand make some stays. I've been using the term stays and bodies interchangeably here, haven't I? Let's hand make a corset. It turns out Queen Elizabeth I was just a touch smaller than me, or at least her effigy was. Either way, I widened the pattern by about 1 inch total to allow myself to breathe. I cut the base from burgundy linen, similarly to the extant bodies. I lapped the center back panels and stitched them in place. I laid the pieces over cotton bobinette, more of a Victorian/Edwardian material than late 16th century, but welcome to my collection, basted around each piece and cut. I marked the boning channels as I went so I wouldn't rub away the stitch line with all the handling. And I hand-stitched the channels using waxed silk thread. Understanding the emotional return on human investment is an important academic pursuit of mine. So I timed every step, and these bodies were fully made by hand. And so if you're wondering just how long it takes to hand-stitch a pair of Elizabethan bodies, stay tuned. For now, I'll just say it took about 7 months to stitch the channels, but I had other projects I was working on during that time. Once they were stitched, I laid red organza over the top, pinned it in place, and cut. I'll add in here that these pins had to hold this thing together through a lot of handwork, and next time I would take the time to baste the piece in place. And this is how we learn what shortcuts to take and which not to. The straps only had the 2 outer layers since there was no boning. I matched the side seams, held back the linen, and stitched the bobinette and organza. There aren't any extant covered bodies from the late 16th century. I definitely could have inferred the construction of the side seams from later stays. I didn't. Moving on. I had this leather on hand. It was definitely too thick to use as binding, and it was suede, which was not ideal, and it was only similar in color, so not the right choice of material, but it was available, so I cut 1-inch strips. I matched it to the bottom edge of the bodies, right sides together, and stitched it with a back stitch. I then folded it over and fell stitched the folded edge to the back. Yes, this made it very stiff and thick. I spent a lot of time wrestling this binding and went through many needles. Yes, these are leather needles. Yes, I wish I had just driven to Tandy and bought the right type of leather. I had to make a decision about the weird side seams when I got there with the binding, so I covered them with bias binding I had left over from that one dress I made. Again, not period practice, but whatever, it was clean. I then stitched the leather binding over the binding. I boned the bodies using period possible reed, which I cut to size and rounded. I backstitched through all layers along the top of the boning. It's important the boning stop shy of the top of the bodies to keep them from rubbing harshly against any embroidery that was common on the smocks of the period. Something you only learn from experience. Trust me on this one. I backstitched the straps in place and covered the raw edge with more bias binding. I bound the upper edges of the bodies the same as the bottom edges. I added eyelets to the center front opening in a spiral-laced configuration. I used cotton embroidery floss. The strap and bodice tip also got eyelets. The leather was very round, so I hammered it flat. I could have used a cloth to keep the hammer from marring the leather, but I actually wanted it to mar the suede. I just made sure it was consistent. In my previous video, I shared a small amount of the development process, mainly these collages I made. The skirt for this look was based on elongated body tabs. Yes, it's a pun because these are often called skirts. Anyway, collaging with Photoshop and making the thing are two different stories entirely. There was a lot of material development that went into the bottom of the look. I tried out contrasting materials, but ultimately chose to use materials that echoed the bodies. There was a lot going on with these pieces, and continuity in color and texture kept it from looking busy or overwrought. The pattern was made from slices of my basic skirt sloper, which I divided at the waist darts. I cut the lining from pink silk cotton blended satin. This is all dead stock fabric, by the way. I laid the satin pieces satin side down on the organza. There were a lot of pieces to the skirt, and I had to be careful to keep the pieces organized. The skirt was very intentionally not done by hand. I machine stitched around the edges of each skirt panel. I cut the seam allowance to 1/4 inch, turned the piece right side out, and pressed the edges crisp. I marked channels to 11 inches from the waist and stitched them on the machine. I marked eyelets down the side of the panels to the edge of the boning. Handmade eyelets are not only visibly distinct from machine eyelets, but they're much stronger, so I made all the eyelets by hand. I made one side of eyelets, then stitched the panels together using a whip stitch. Again, this is a much stronger seam and was worth the handwork. I then added eyelets to the other edge. When the front and back panels were complete, I boned the channels. This was another area I thought long and hard about and did about a dozen samples for. I ultimately chose a pretty peach ribbon, which creates a similar color to the reed boning, and used the two interspersed throughout the panel. Here you may be wondering, how do you sit in that? You don't. I laced burgundy ribbon through the eyelets. These eyelets weren't in a spiral lacing configuration, so I used two ribbons going through every other eyelet to sort of fake it. Obviously the panels are stitched together, so this isn't functional anyway. I matched the front and back panel at the hip and stitched them together. I added eyelets. I left the center back unstitched, so this lacing is functional as the closure. I laid a 1-inch wide burgundy ribbon over the waist edge and back stitched. I folded the ribbon to the back side and felled it in place. I tucked the ends of the lacing ribbons in on the inside, but left them out on the outside to sort of mimic the lacing of skirts and trunk hose and stuff. The ends of the ribbon were long to tie the waist shut. My main motivation for hand-stitching the bodies was obviously to earn the hand-stitched a corset YouTuber street cred, but also to finally answer the question one always gets when one wears a handmade complex garment. How long did that take you, and where can I buy it? Well folks, the bodies by the numbers. There is 855 inches of hand stitching just in the boning channels, so at an average of 1.5 inches a minute, that is 570 minutes or 9.5 hours of stitching in the boning channels, plus 432 minutes or 7.2 hours to stitch the 144 inches of binding, twice, so 14.4 hours, 72 minutes, which still does not sound right, to stitch the 36 eyelets, 63 minutes of cutting, including basting, 123 minutes of boning, and 26 minutes a pop for those side seams and the straps brings us to a grand total of 1,744 minutes, or about 29 hours to make these bodies. Actually, it doesn't sound like that much, compared to about 18 hours to make the skirt. Using the difference a machine can make. If I were trying to sell these bodies and was paid the minimum wage for my state, that would make the labor alone $436. Also does not sound like a lot. Add in material cost of $72 and overhead of $12, and we have a base cost of $520. Google AI says I should double that to get my wholesale cost, so $1,040 if I were going to sell this wholesale to a retailer. Makes those $200 corsets on Etsy look like a bargain, huh? And just keeping up with the canon of this collection, this is the official collection pairing to the insertion lace t-shirt I made previously. When is it worth using period or handwork, and when is it indulgent? When does period detail become costume? Does any of it affect the emotional value of the piece? Does it matter? If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up. And hit subscribe if you enjoy a little costume in your closet. The next look is on the way, if the lace for it ever gets here. Bye!